Hi and welcome everyone and to today's webinar where we're going to talk about Talent Management 101. How do you keep your talent engaged over time? Super interesting topic, and I think very relevant right now considering how many layoffs and how many self-resigning employees we're seeing as well. So it's a very, very relevant topic, and we're super happy to have you guys here to talk about it. But before you get to introduce yourself, my name is Tove. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm the Events and Community Manager here at Alva Labs. And who are we at Alva? Some of you might not know. We are a platform for psychometric assessments. So we work to, as you see on the screen, make a difference with every hire. We really want to help companies to make the best of their recruitment process, spend their time with the right candidate. And we do that with the help of personality and logic assessments, as well as structured interviews. So that's a little bit about us, but today we're going to talk talent management. And Kajsa, I would love for you to introduce yourself.
Yes, so great to be here. Hi, everyone. My name is Kajsa Asplund. I work at Alva Labs as a lead people science, which basically means that I'm in charge of making sure that what we build rhymes with current research and that we offer our customers the most evidence-based product that we can. I'm a psychologist to begin with, and I've spent most of my career working in organizational psychology in different types of roles. And for many years, I was at Stockholm School of Economics pursuing research in the area of talent management, and that's where I have my PhD from then. And also wrote a more popularized book on that subject that's called Talent for Humans, unfortunately only available in Swedish.
So far. And then I asked you for a fun fact, and you said you're a huge Disney fan, but please tell us a little bit about how does this come about? Do people notice this about you, Kajsa?
I think they do. Guilty as charged. I tend to drag in all these Disney references from time to time. I've been a huge Disney fan since I was a child, right? And it's happened more than once that I go to Disney store and buy something for myself, and then the cashier sort of asks me, "Who's this for?" And I sort of have to admit that it's for me. But now at least I have a 3.5-year-old daughter who I can sort of place this Disney fandom on. So that's
so you can always blame her when you buy stuff now.
Exactly.
Yeah, love it. All right, thank you, Kajsa. And what are we going to talk about today? Well, talent management, we know that, but we're going to talk about what it actually is and some common misconceptions or old ways of looking at talent management. We're also going to talk about the difference between a content and an actually engaged talent or employee in general. And then we're going to talk about practical tips on what you can actually start doing today to ensure that your talents feel challenged, but also engaged with your company. And we are recording the session. We will be sending out the recording afterwards, as well as the slides. So you will get the full slide deck. We love to hear questions as well. So if you have any burning questions or anything that you're wondering throughout the presentation today, drop them in the chat or the Q&A function, and we'll get to questions towards the end of today's session. All right, Kajsa, let's start by defining talent a little bit so that we all talk about the same thing or hear the same thing when we talk about talent today.
Yes. So talent is one of those mythical concepts, right? That keeps flying around. And I think that sort of explains its longevity as well, that people can actually put their own meaning into this term, right? But it's also a bit problematic given that when people say that they're discussing their talent strategies or their talent management practices, it's not a given that they're talking about the same thing, right? But there are, of course, some common denominators, and I think we can all agree that talent is somehow about being particularly good at something, and in the area of working life, it's often sort of close in meaning to strategic competence or something like that, right? But over time, we've actually seen a bit of a change in how this term is used as well, where I think we've come from a more exclusive view towards a somewhat more inclusive view, or where talent is seen as something broader, something more moldable, and not being sort of synonymous to an A-player team or a star team or something like that.
And let's deep dive a little bit into that, because I think very interesting that we kind of have the old way of looking at talent and then the present way of looking at talent. And we have some differences there as well in the current workplace, of course, of how people actually define this and think about it. But let's look at the two options.
Yes, exactly. So if you go a bit back in time, I would say that this sort of exclusive view on talent, which originally comes from the sort of Anglo-American context, right, sort of dominated the scene, where talent was seen as being a few people, a small group of A players or stars, right? And also this idea of talent being something stable, that those who are talents are always going to be talents, and they are going to be talents no matter where they go. So talent as something stable and also something portable, right? That very much sort of resides within the individual. And even if it wasn't always pronounced, I think it was sort of a given that it was also innate, that this is something that you sort of born with or carry with you over time. And this, of course, led to very much a scarcity view, right? That there are only a chosen few out there, and as employers, we compete for these talents, right? So I think that's an important part of the background to this term, the war for talent.
Absolutely. And then if we look at the more current scientific definition.
Yes, so over time, I would say, not least in the last decade, we've seen a shift towards a more inclusive view and a more perhaps nuanced view. Of course, no one denies that different competences, different skill sets are unevenly distributed among people, and that people are good at different things. But I think we have come to realize, not least through modern day research, that these skills and these abilities are often very moldable, and they develop over time, right? And also, I would say that the context and the team, the importance of those entities has risen enormously in people's minds, right? And we realize that it's not only about getting a star individual in here and this person is going to save us. It's more about placing a person in an environment where they can actually grow and flourish, and where we have a great match between different team members and so on. So I would say that we have come to a somewhat more nuanced perspective.
Very interesting. And I mean, it goes without saying that I have to ask this question then, but is everyone a talent if we look at this definition?
Very good question. It depends on who you ask, I would say, and it depends a lot on actually the culture and values within organizations as well. We could actually see in our research that in some organizations, talent management is defined as activities that you do to identify, develop, and retain those that are especially important for the company's long-term well-being. So people that are especially good at different things, or people that are in especially important roles and so on. Whereas in other organizations, you define talent management as those broad initiatives that you do to harness everyone's talents, right? So it depends a little bit on who you ask. But to some extent, I would dare say that in order to be perceived as a modern day organization with attractive values, it's usually much more fruitful to come from the perspective that everyone has strengths, everyone has skills that they can develop and grow, and that the attitude and the sort of motivation that you bring into that role is given a lot of importance.
Very interesting, and good answer to that question as well, Kajsa. But going from this, then, we know now we all have the same idea of what a talent is, or at least we have some ideas of what it is. Let's talk about why we need to focus on talent management, because this is, I mean, it's something some organizations choose to do and some don't, but why should we focus on it, Kajsa?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that no organization can really afford not to focus on these issues anymore. Since it's plain to see that our human capital is the most important capital that we as a business have, regardless of industry today, right? So the sort of relative competitive advantage that you could have from logistics, from materials, from whatever other resources that you had in the organization has actually diminished a lot over time, since the pace of change has only accelerated, and we're entering this sort of knowledge and service economy, right? So the people that you have are without doubt your most important resource, and as without capable employees we have no business at all, right? So this is the background to why this has garnered so much interest in recent years.
But despite that, it's not really I don't know, I'm gonna pull up some statistics here and I want to hear your thoughts on this, Kajsa.
Yes. So in the last decade or two, we've seen a real spike in interest in talent management, right? It's been one of those buzzwords flying around. And we've also seen a lot of companies starting up these different initiatives, sometimes driven by consultancy firms, sometimes initiated by themselves. However, the results have not always been on par with the efforts made. And sometimes we could see that very clearly in our research project. Some organizations even get some really unintended consequences of these initiatives. So even though about 80% of leaders in different studies actually rank talent management as critical, very few are satisfied with their practices, which indicates that there are some assumptions here or some starting points that aren't really correct.
Exactly. So if I hear you correctly, where companies are putting an effort into having a talent management program or thinking about talent management in some way, but they aren't necessarily doing it in the best way possible.
Exactly.
Very interesting. And this last point here, Kajsa, does it have to be that difficult?
No, it would be my short answer. Not if you sort of try to get it right to begin with. And this is what we're going to talk a lot about in the rest of the webinar, right? But starting with sort of how you view talent in the organization, making sure that that rhymes with your sort of culture and values, but also with modern day research, of course, is really important. And then also to try to navigate away from certain pitfalls, which we'll talk more about soon.
Of course. And going into that, or more into that, we need to talk about what actually makes a talent happy. So how do we kind of judge that a talent is happy with us, with their job, with their organization? And there's two different terms here that I would love for you to define and talk a little about, Kajsa, that came up a lot in your research as well.
Yes, so this is a distinction that that is important to make, I think, because it's all about sort of what's a successful outcome of a talent initiative. One outcome could be satisfied employees, right? So this concept of job satisfaction, which has been around for decades, it's very well established, and for a long time, I would say that organizations tried to measure the success of their talent management initiatives by looking at do we have high job satisfaction among our talents. But over time, what research has actually shown is that job satisfaction is not that closely related to performance or productivity. And the reason behind that is that job satisfaction is actually a pretty passive state. This is more of a state of contentment, if you will. So being at peace with what you have at work, feeling content with your salary, with your coworkers, with your manager, with your situation overall. So this sort of feeling of saturation, if you will, which doesn't necessarily spark those especially high performance levels. So what research started doing was to look at sort of what's a more activated, aroused, positive emotional state. And that's why interest in engagement instead started exploding in research. Because you can actually see that this stage is what's more closely related to performance, productivity, and even profitability, actually. And here we're talking about a much more active state, right? Where you are investing yourself in your job, where you feel this sort of both emotional and cognitive sense of importance at work, and you sort of bring yourself into your job role instead of just performing it as a given script. And this state has been connected to a lot of very positive outcomes. So I think this is a first important distinction to make. Are you opting for satisfied talents, or are you opting for engaged talents?
We got a really good question that, and I know I said I was going to save questions towards the end, but I think this one plays really well into these two terms, because someone asked here in a really good question, how do you reflect over the new thing called quiet quitting? And I think that relates a lot to if someone is content or if someone is engaged, right? Or what's your thoughts on that?
Certainly, I think that's a really interesting connection to make. And I don't think there are a lot of studies on this, since quiet quitting is also this kind of new term. But overall, my guess would be that quiet quitting is not that uncommon among satisfied employees, but not something that you would see a lot in engaged employees, because the hallmark of an engaged employee is someone who is pretty vocal, right? So, someone who is not only sort of cognitively attached to their work, but also emotionally. So that's actually one of the things that I often say to managers when they talk about managing highly engaged employees, that be prepared to manage emotion, which also means that when things are not the way they should be, when they discover flaws or things that could be better, engaged employees tend to be quite vocal. Whereas a satisfied employee who is not very engaged at work, the only thing that person might need in order to quit is a better offer. So I would say that if you have really engaged employees, the risk of quiet quitting is probably lower.
Very, very good insight. Thank you, Kajsa. And I mean, it goes without saying then that we, in order to keep our talents, one of the things we really should focus on, right, is to create that engagement. So let's talk about what we actually need to provide them with in order to keep talents engaged.
Yes. So there are a number of different things, but there's a first little cluster of things, I would say, that have to do with clarity of expectations. There are a lot of different studies on the sort of outcomes of, not least of appointing people as talents or telling people that they are talents. And the clearest finding so far to date is that people who are told that they are talents, so that they are high potentials, or that the organization sort of views them as a talent, is that they get higher expectations on the organization. And what you need to do then is to provide a very sort of clear group of terms on sort of what could a career path look like for you here, and what are the different possibilities. And even if it's not possible to paint a very clear career path, because in some organizations that's just not possible, it's better to be clear about that. So trying to be as transparent as possible here is sort of key in order to make people want to stay and develop with you.
Very good. And understandable.
Yeah, exactly. And very related to that is that I sometimes hear these fears about that, if you tell someone that they're a talent or that they're really good, they're just going to sort of rest on their laurels and stop making an effort. There's no evidence whatsoever in research for that. On the contrary, the people who are perceived as talents are usually, they sort of have this as a more or less personality trait, right? That they tend to work really hard and they set really high standards for themselves. What they do expect, however, is someone to support them. So someone to sort of lead the way through the organization. And that can be in terms of, helping them clear the path when there's an obstacle somehow, helping them navigate in the internal politics or the way the organization is structured, having that sort of mentorship also. So when you're able to provide that in combination with telling people that we really believe in you, we think you're one of our high potentials or whatever, that can be a really powerful combination.
Very, very good. And then there's a couple more factors here that we need to consider if we think of the first three as kind of aligning together.
Yes, exactly. And And this one is very much related to engagement. So one of the most important sort of drivers of engagement is the sense of autonomy at work. So feeling like you're not being micromanaged, like you have enough sort of decision latitude to design work the way that you see fit. And of course, this means very different things depending on the seniority level, the kind of work that you do. But I would say that in all organizations, in all jobs, a good sort of engagement inducing activity is to try to reduce all unnecessary bureaucracy that you can, and also to adopt a leadership style that moves away from micromanagement and gives a lot of own responsibility. And I think that's also perceived as a modern way of managing talent.
Makes sense. And then the last one here.
Yes, and this is actually directly taken from my dissertation, where one of the main findings was that people who are identified as talents or high potentials, or people who just generally get that signal that they're valued and the organization wants them to move up, they start quite early on to identify with management, which means that it doesn't take all that long before they're not motivated by doing only the daily grind, if you will. They want to be involved when strategic decisions are made. They want to have a seat at the table when those big sort of holistic themes of the organization are discussed. And that's what they start to find more motivating. Trying to provide that to talents quite early on is usually a really good way to make them feel seen, make them feel important. And also, of course, that goes both ways, because you usually also get that new and fresh perspective into the discussions, right? So keeping that in mind, that talents tend to identify with management and they want that kind of, they want access to those kinds of discussions.
And that's something that I think, I mean, in all of this, it's always easier to say things than to actually do them, right? But this might be one of the more difficult things to do, because usually there's not only hierarchies, but there's also a limit of how many people can be involved in a decision. So what would you say is a good first step, or something that you as a manager can do to at least make your talents feel that they're engaged in the decisions or a part of it?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And of course, this depends a lot on the to what extent you have this kind of hierarchical structure in the organization, how big the organization is, and so on. But I think what everyone can do is to make sure that those managers that are closest to the talents make an effort to collect their view, right? And signal to them that their views matter. And then, of course, you might not be able to reveal everything that's being discussed in a certain management team and so on. But as soon as you can, at least ask for their input. And I've seen in several of the biggest companies in the Nordics that you actually create these sort of shadow management teams, if you will, made up by high potentials, where they get to attack important strategic challenges and present their suggestions, their insights to the actual management team. And that's usually really appreciated on both ends, because the talents feel seen, they feel stimulated, they feel like they've been included in important decisions, and the management team gets another set of eyes on an important issue. So that might be a way as well.
Absolutely. And then we have a little note of caution here as well.
Yes, exactly. I would say that a general principle in organizational psychology, this goes not only for talent management, is that once a promise has been made, or when people perceive that a promise has been made, they very seldom forget about that. So when people feel like they have been promised a certain career development, that's something that you as an organization will have to try to live up to. Because the moment you tell people that they're talents, or that you are willing to invest in them or whatever, this sort of psychological contract that you have with the organization is going to shift. And what do you expect? Well, not necessarily a sort of clear and easy path forward, but at least that sort of clear plan regarding sort of what do you want to use me for? you say that I have all these skills and abilities. Well, how do you want me to use them in the organization? That there has to be some kind of plan there. I remember when I wrote my book, I interviewed one pretty senior talent who had recently quit his job just 1 year after being appointed to their sort of high flyer talent program. And what he told me was that, well, when they told me that I was a talent, I thought, then there might be a plan for me. And when I realized that, well, there is no plan whatsoever, then I figured, then what am I doing here, right? So making sure that when you start talking to people about them being a talent, that you also have a plan for the development going forward. That's really important.
Very good. And I mean, now we've talked about a lot of things that you can do and you should do and focus on, but let's talk about some things that you can actually start with today, because this can, like all topics when it comes to HR and people in general, it can feel quite difficult to get started. So let's talk about some of these things that you can do today, Kajsa.
Yes. So I think one of the first things is to make sure that you talk about talent as behaviors, right? And not necessarily as absolute traits. So instead of creating a talent program for our future leader stars or our A players or something like that, talk about what do you want these talents to do in the organization? What results would you like them to drive within the organization? Because this is both a way, I think, of making the talent concept more inclusive. It sort of opens up the minds for a more diverse set of talents, but also it becomes a lot more concrete. And one thing that's been shown in research is that when you start labeling people a lot as talents or stars or future leader or whatever, this creates a lot of anxiety, because as soon as you get that kind of high flyer label, you get really afraid to lose it as well. So what happens is that those people that got the talent stamp, because of their unique qualities, because of their sort of idiosyncratic ways of thinking, actually turn very conventional because they get so afraid of failing. So they stop trying out these crazy ideas, they stop asking stupid questions, they stop taking risks. But when you phrase it more in terms of what do you want these people to do, then that becomes a lot less threatening and also clearer, I think.
Very good point. Very interesting point as well, Kajsa. And then the next one.
Right. So this has to do with autonomy as well, right? So making sure that you provide that leeway for people to grow on their own. But another part of this is that we've been talking about the importance of having a plan here, right? Or being able to present the talent with a clear sort of career trajectory and so on. But that I really want to point out that that is, of course, not the same as acting like their parent in the organization, right? It's still really, really important to emphasize that you are in the driver's seat of your own development. I'm here to help. I'm here to coach you. I'm here to bounce ideas and be your sounding board, and perhaps also sanity check what's possible and not possible in the organization. But you are in the driver's seat, right? And that has the added benefit of sort of de-chunking your plate as a manager, right? Because if you are going to be responsible in an operative sense for everyone's development, then you are going to be super swamped. So that is something that the talent has to drive him or herself, and you are there as the sort of sounding board.
And then the last one here.
Right. So I think that this also mirrors one of the most common mistakes that are made in talent management today, namely that when you identify a really, really competent employee, you give them more to do, which is natural, right? Because they tend to perform no matter what task you throw at them. But there are several problems involved with this sort of more of the same attitude to talent development, right? One is that it doesn't really provide a very steep learning curve if you just give talents more of the same types of tasks. And number two is that it also significantly increases the risk of burnout, right? And people feeling overwhelmed and stressed at work. So it's usually a much better idea to consider what would be a real stretch assignment for this person. What would be something that they haven't done before, something that they haven't seen before, perhaps through some kind of rotation or inviting them to work on a challenge that's sort of one level up compared to where they've been before, switching departments or whatever, but trying to provide new challenges rather than just more of the same.
Very good. Thank you, Kajsa. And we are going to move into questions shortly. But thank you so much for that, Kajsa. And what would you say? I mean, now we're talked about what talent is, what we need to kind of keep talent engaged, and then also some of those things that you can actually start working on already today. What would you say is your number one, like, don't do this when it comes to talents? This might be a difficult question.
I think it's a really good question. It is difficult, but one thing that I would emphasize is don't do nothing. It's actually, I mean, I could underline the importance of not making promises that you can't hold, making sure that you have a plan when you present people to this talent concept and so on. But I think it's actually even more important to underline that you can't really afford to do nothing. And just the other day, I had this conversation with a manager who said that, but there's a really big risk involved here. What if I invest a lot in the development and education and training of this person, and then they leave? Then I've just paid for another employer's great employee. But then you could just turn that around, right, and saying, what if you don't invest and they and they stay, or you don't invest and the best ones will leave anyway, right? So the importance of taking an active stance here, I think, is the most important one.
Very good. All right, let's move on to questions, because we've gotten quite a few of them, so that's good. But thank you, Kajsa. And I also want to, of course, say that in 2 weeks we have another webinar, and that one we're actually kind of going to keep talking about this, because we're going to talk a lot about scaling up. How do you go from startup to scale up to grown up, and what do you need in terms of people, in terms of everything people related during those different stages? So I hope that you join us then too, to kind of continue down the rabbit hole of how can you think about this regardless of which stage your company is in. But let's take some questions now, Kajsa. And I think one of the questions that came in quite early, which I think is a really interesting one, is it ideal to create 2 different types of engagement strategies for blue collar and white collar? Or is it better to have one focus for the whole company? I feel like the focus is a lot stronger for white collar. I think this is a great question.
Very good question, and a very current one as well. And I've seen several companies struggling a lot with this, where you have one set of employees that are out in stores, perhaps, or in a sort of industry setting, and then you have the HQ, where you have a completely different set of employees. And I would say that the basics can usually be the same, because the basic needs, the basic human needs behind engagement and satisfaction at work are very much the same. It's about this sense of meaning, right? Psychological safety, autonomy, feeling challenged at work, and so on. So those things are the same no matter what. But of course, the initiatives that you need to drive can be quite different when you compare blue collar to white collar. But I think it makes sense to have some kind of common ground for all employees, since that's usually tied to what you're striving for as an organization, what you stand for, your values, your culture, and so on. But then the initiatives, the concrete things that you do, can often need to be quite different.
Very, good answer. It makes a lot of sense. And I think it's really important to think about, of course, the differences between white collar and blue collar. And as this person said in their question too, focus might be stronger on white collar normally, but that doesn't mean we should keep it that way. Another question here. So it's quite difficult to keep talent right now. People are resigning left and right. Is there anything specific from research that we could be doing to retain talent longer?
Very good question. So this is a challenge that many people struggle with right now. And overall, I would say that I would like to underline the importance of the managers that are closest to the employees. There is some truth to this saying that you don't leave an organization, you leave a manager. So there's been a lot of research showing that when you feel like you're not being heard, you're not being listened to, you don't have a good rapport with your closest manager, that's one of the biggest sort of factors that make you leave. So really making sure that you attend to the need for training, being sure that your managers are equipped with skills in coaching, mentoring, feedback culture, supporting employees and all those things. This is really, really important, and especially important right now, I would say. Also because it is the closest manager who can usually spot the first signals that someone might be looking for something else. So investing there is especially important, I would say.
Very good. And now, this was also an interesting one. I think came in regarding when you spoke about having like a second, like a talent leadership team, right? So that you have the real leadership team and then you have like a talent version of it. Is there a risk that a shadow table can quickly become a toxic environment, like an A and B team?
Very interesting question as well. Definitely. I am not sure. I haven't seen actual examples of that. I think it's very important when you form something like this to be clear about what the purpose is and what the sort of decision latitude for that group is. I think in the examples that I've seen, this shadow table has rather perceived it as a really valuable opportunity to get to see what the management team's work really looks like earlier on. But of course, that depends on that management team being really interested in what this shadow group has to say, right? Otherwise, I think it will probably fall flat.
Absolutely. And I think a question from myself, now that we mentioned like an A and B team, I think a question that is often thought about when it comes to talent, right, is if we assign a group of people as talents, what does that make the rest of the employees? What does research say about that? Like, how do you go about being able to have a talent management program or being able to actually label people in that way without excluding the other group? And I guess part of it is what you spoke about earlier with how you actually talk about things, right? It's not an absolute, it's more so that you describe it as in behaviors. But what else can you do to kind of minimize the A and B team feeling in general?
Yes, very good question. There are some really interesting studies showing that this is a real risk. If you don't handle it carefully, you could actually get quite a drop in engagement and satisfaction among those who are not appointed as talents. So it's wise to tread lightly here. And the most important thing that you can do, according to research, is to try to be transparent and try to be fair. So being as open as you possibly can about what's the purpose of this talent pool or talent program. How did we go about defining the criteria for who gets to be in this? What are the selection methods? How do we choose who gets to be part of it? How can I develop myself if I want to get in the next time? What are my sort of skills gaps, if you will? And who can I talk to if I have questions about this? So as much transparency as you possibly can.
Very good. And we have a question here about motivation. We actually have two of them, so I'll take the first one first. So how do you see and define the difference between engagement and motivation?
Yes, that's an interesting one as well. So again, these are concepts that people tend to fill with their own meaning, right? But if you look at it from a research perspective, I would say that engagement is a somewhat narrower term. So engagement is defined as this state of active and aroused sense of wanting to make an effort at work, and it's very much geared towards the task, right? So not necessarily the organization, but the task that you have at hand. Whereas motivation is a really, really broad concept in psychology that has to do with every sort of any sort of force that makes you do something, right? And you can see that there is definitely an overlap between what you call intrinsic motivation and engagement over time. So engaged employees tend to have a lot of intrinsic motivation in the sense that they perceive meaning in the task per se, and they are motivated to perform that task even though no one is telling them to. So there's definitely an overlap, I would say, between engagement and intrinsic motivation.
Interesting. And that kind of ties a little bit into the next question here that we got, which is, this person is a motivational mapping practitioner. And I agree that there's no such thing as inherent talent that needs to be developed. However, the way to get talent engaged is to be aware of what their motivators are, otherwise your efforts will be less effective. Do you see an important role for motivational mapping in the development of talent?
Well, even though I am not very familiar with that term, as it is described here, I would definitely say yes, that this is something that skilled managers, career coaches, and HR practitioners need to do, right? You need to identify what are the drivers that this person has. For some people, that might be really, really clear that you're a very sort of passion-driven person and you want to work on a particular type of problems or tasks. Others see themselves more as generalists, right? And might be more, might attend more to the type of context that they want to work in and so on. But definitely, this is part of successful career coaching, I would say.
Excellent. And another question here, what can I as a leader do to pick up on if one of my team isn't happy or isn't motivated? How can I change that?
Very good question as well. And of course, the first step is to really try to take the time to listen, right? And try to show this sort of true intention of understanding what's the problem, right? Trying to get to the bottom of that. There are some go-tos, of course. When a whole team is disengaged, there's usually something around the leadership that needs some extra attention. But in these times, we also see that it might be related to stress, it might be related to pressure and those types of things. Indicators that you can look at are, of course, employee survey data, but you can actually also see it in the level of activity on anything from chat forums to email and so on, where you can actually see that when people start being a lot less active on those forums than they usually are, that can actually be a signal that something's going on here. So there are some different signals to pick up.
Absolutely. And what can you do once you pick up those signals, Kajsa?
I would say hear them out as much as you can, first of all. Look at some of those usual suspects, the leadership, the stress level, the level of independence that they have. And then I think the most important next step is to show these people that you've heard them and that you are trying to work as hard as you can to provide a solution, and also include these people in the solution, right? Make them part of the solution as well, and so that you don't get too slow as a manager here, but really trying to provide autonomy in that kind of problem solving as well.
Absolutely. Great answer. As far as I can see, I think we've answered all the questions. If we haven't, then please reach out afterwards. But otherwise, it's time to round off today's webinar. Thank you so much, Kajsa, for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you, and it's so nice to have you back at Alva with us. Thank you also to everyone who's joined and who's asked really terrific questions. Feel free to reach out to me and, of course, Kajsa afterwards. Connect on LinkedIn if you want to continue the discussion. And I, of course, also hope that you join us next week when, as I said, we will continue talking about talent and all things people in different stages of the organization, together with Alexander Verdi, who is a scale-up coach or scale-up advisor. And we will send out the presentation, the recording, and a link to the upcoming webinar as well shortly, so that you have those. Happy weekend, and thank you so much. Thank you, Kajsa, and see you next time.
Thank you so much, Tove. See you soon.